Picture this. Okay, it's Cairo, early 2011. You're standing in the middle of Tahrir Square, and you're just surrounded by what can only be described as this massive, spontaneous carnival.
Oh, absolutely. The energy was just, it was electric.
Right. The air is practically vibrating. And the crazy thing is, just days prior, this was a grim, heavily monitored space. I mean, state security was everywhere. It was a place where people kept their heads down, mouths shut, and then boom.
Yeah, overnight.
Literally overnight, it completely transforms. You've got ordinary citizens organizing their own security cordons. They're setting up these makeshift medical tents to treat the wounded. And I read they even coordinated separate garbage cans for organic waste.
I mean, the level of organization is wild.
It really is. It's this stunning display of joyful grassroots order. But, you know, the contrast is just absolutely jarring. How on earth does an entire society go from decades of terrified, paralyzed silence to an explosion of organized defiance, like overnight?
Well, it looks like magic from the outside, but it's sort of the ultimate paradox of human behavior. You observe a population that has been completely suppressed for a generation, showing zero public signs of rebellion, right?
Right.
They seem totally docile.
Yeah, completely compliant.
Exactly. And then, in the blink of an eye, the fear just evaporates. It isn't this gradual, localized shift. It is a sudden, seismic rupture in the entire fabric of the society.
And that rupture is exactly what we are exploring with you today. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a massive stack of research today, everything from sociological studies on the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the Arab Spring to clinical trauma reports out of Romania, Libya, Iraq, and Syria.
It's a heavy stack for sure.
It is. But our mission here is to map the psychological anatomy of a revolution. We aren't just doing a historical recap or, a political play-by-play.
Right, because that's been done.
Exactly. We are digging into the collective emotions, the hidden mechanisms that break down that fear barrier, and this is crucial, the heavy, often devastating psychological hangovers that set in when an authoritarian regime finally collapses.
Because when a state's monopoly on violence dissolves, the standard rules of human behavior just completely change. To really grasp what happens to a country, we have to look past the structural politics, right? We have to dive into the moral and psychological dynamics that actually govern ordinary people in these extraordinary high-stakes moments.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the pre-revolutionary state, the pressure cooker. Reading through these academic theories, it is fascinating to see how they map out the mind of a citizen under a dictatorship. I mean, why do people endure oppression for so long, and what finally makes them crack?
So we can trace that back to a core concept developed by sociologist Timur Kuran. He calls it preference falsification.
Preference falsification.
Right. Basically, in a highly repressive regime, individuals are forced to maintain a public persona of total, unwavering compliance. They cheer for the dictator at parades. They hang portraits of the leader in their shops. They go along to get along.
Yeah, just trying to survive.
Exactly. But privately, deep down, they harbor a profound hatred for the regime. The state basically creates an environment where the external threat of punishment, being thrown in prison, tortured, or disappeared by the secret police, that drastically outweighs the internal moral cost of lying to yourself every single day.
Wow. And the sources use this incredible metaphor for that state of mind. They described the Egyptian secret police as having created a Maginot Line in the brains of the citizens.
Oh, I love that analogy.
It's so good. Now, if you remember your history, the Maginot Line was that massive, heavily fortified concrete wall the French built in World War II to keep the Germans out. They thought it was completely impenetrable.
Right, the ultimate defense.
Yeah. And the authors are arguing that an authoritarian state builds a psychological version of that wall inside your own mind. It's an internalized plug in the mouth. Dissent is born, and then it immediately dies in silence, like right inside your own head.
You don't even share it with your spouse or your children.
Because you never know who might be an informant, right?
Exactly. And that internalized wall is so effective because private preferences are entirely hidden. Nobody actually knows the true extent of the opposition. Everyone thinks they're literally the only one who hates the government.
It's like being at a terrible, painfully awkward dinner party where everyone is completely miserable, but nobody wants to be the first to offend the host. So everyone just sits there, forcing a smile, eating terrible food.
Best analogy ever, yes.
Right. But the second one person finally grabs their coat to leave, suddenly there's a massive stampede for the door.
And that stampede is what sociologists call the revolutionary threshold. The moment people realize they aren't alone, you get this explosive bandwagon effect. But the pressure that builds up to that breaking point, it usually stems from a phenomenon called relative deprivation.
Okay, what's that?
This is the dangerous, combustible gap between what a population expects out of life and what they actually experience.
Yeah.
You saw this exact dynamic play out perfectly in pre-1979 Iran.
So walk us through what the Iranian middle class was experiencing before that revolution broke out, because it wasn't just extreme poverty, right?
No, not at all. The Shah of Iran was pushing incredibly rapid modernization and urbanization throughout the 1970s. Wealth was literally pouring into the country from oil revenues.
Right, oil boom.
Yeah, but that new wealth was mixed with massive economic inequality, total political exclusion, and profound cultural alienation for the new urban middle class. They were being told, their country was becoming a global superpower, so their expectations were rising astronomically.
Oh, so they expected a better life.
Exactly. Yet their daily reality was stagnant or even worsening. They couldn't afford housing, they had absolutely no political voice, and they watched this corrupt elite just flaunt their wealth. That gap between expectation and reality, that is what produces a profound latent anger.
Wait, but does that gap between expectation and reality apply everywhere, though? Because looking at the sources on Romania in 1989, under the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, it didn't seem like people had high expectations at all. It seemed like they were literally just trying to survive the winter.
That's such a great point. Romania is a fascinating counterexample here. The terror of their secret police, the Securitate, was so absolute, and the economic conditions were so incredibly austere that the population wasn't dealing with unmet expectations of luxury or, political force.
They were starving.
They had reached the absolute limit of biological survival. People were freezing in their apartments. They were rationing bread. So the psychological rupture in Romania was driven by sheer daily despair. It reached a point where the internal cost of that preference falsification, of forcing yourself to praise the leader while your children were literally starving, that finally outweighed the fear of death.
Man, that is bleak.
It is. It created this strange, incredibly powerful sentiment of self-sacrifice where unharmed people were willing to stand directly in front of military tanks.
So the pressure is building, whether it's from shattered expectations like in Iran or pure biological desperation like in Romania. The silent resentment is there, but what actually triggers the stampede? Because it's not like the dictator sends out a memo saying, hey, the secret police are taking a long weekend. How does a population suddenly lose its fear?
Well, the trigger is fundamentally a massive shift in a society's baseline emotions. Under authoritarianism, the dominant everyday emotions are fear and humiliation. And humiliation is arguably the most corrosive force on the human psyche.
It just wears you down.
Completely. It's the daily indignity of having no say in your destiny, being forced to pay bribes for basic services, feeling entirely powerless and worthless. The spark that ignites the transition from fear and humiliation to active anger and a demand for dignity that is almost always completely unpredictable.
And usually it's highly relatable, right? It's almost never a grand geopolitical event or a foreign policy dispute. It's, the Tunisian fruit seller whose cart is confiscated by corrupt police, and he sets himself on fire outside a government building out of sheer absolute desperation.
Exactly.
It's a localized, deeply human tragedy that suddenly just resonates with millions.
Or consider that incredible story from the Egyptian uprising highlighted in the sources. Remember the blogger?
Oh, yes. The cat guy.
Yes. So this prominent blogger is arrested during a small protest, and he's thrown into a stinking, crowded police truck. He's terrified. He knows exactly what happens in state prisons.
Torture, right?
Right. So he's trying to distract himself by doing mental math, visualizing the beach, just desperately trying to survive the panic attack. And then, sitting there in the dark, he suddenly remembers he forgot to feed his cats.
I mean, it sounds almost absurd, but he realizes his apartment is empty, he might be locked up for years, and his cats might slowly starve to death, and suddenly he is just furiously angry.
Right. He thinks, what do my cats have to do with this regime? Why do they have to suffer because of this dictator? And that paralyzing fear is instantly replaced by pure moral outrage.
Just a total switch flipped in his brain.
Exactly. Moral outrage momentarily overcomes the existential fear of torture. He starts banging on the walls of the truck. And once that fear breaks on a mass scale, the final two emotions of revolution flood the streets: pride and exhilaration. When you see hundreds of thousands of people feeling that exact same anger, you realize your own power. You are no longer an isolated, terrified individual. You are a force of nature.
There's this unbelievable quote from an Egyptian publisher who was standing in Tahrir Square during those early days. He looked around at the crowds and said, "Suddenly, we are human beings."
Gives you chills.
It really does. The sheer psychological high of realizing you have value, that you aren't just some cog there to serve a corrupt elite.
And how that shared emotion is communicated that actually dictates the speed and the ultimate nature of the uprising. This brings up the role of technology and mass psychology. During the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the primary communication tool was audio cassette tapes of Ayatollah Khomeini.
Cassette tapes. So retro.
Yeah, he was in exile, but his sermons were smuggled in, copied thousands of times, and played in mosques across the entire country.
But that is a completely one-way psychological projection. You are sitting in a room receiving the vision and the instructions of a single, definitive leader.
Precisely. Now compare that to the Arab Spring, where the primary engine was social media. Facebook pages, like the April 6th youth movement in Egypt, they created a network society. It allowed for horizontal organization. There was no single leader handing down orders.
Everyone's just kind of talking to each other.
Exactly. It created what researchers call an inner reality, a shared virtual space where people could curate their revolutionary identities, share videos of police brutality, and basically feel like they were part of a massive, unstoppable movement before they ever even stepped foot into the physical street.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to push back a bit on the glorification of that social media dynamic. Because doesn't a platform like Facebook also create an addictive feedback loop? Like if the network runs on the fear of missing out on FOMO, doesn't it naturally prioritize instant emotional outrage over actual long-term strategic planning?
Oh, 100%.
You get the dopamine hit of a retweet, but that doesn't draft a constitution.
That is a highly valid critique, and the geopolitical results absolutely bear it out. Social media is incredibly effective at dismantling fear and assembling a massive crowd, right? But it is terrible at building institutions.
Because it's so chaotic.
Right. The chaotic, leaderless nature of these digital uprisings means there is no hierarchy. Because everyone is a leader online, there is no single representative to actually negotiate with the old regime once the dictator falls. These movements prioritize the visceral thrill of the protest over the slow, boring, deeply necessary work of forming a transitional government.
It's all exhilaration, no administration.
That's a great way to put it. While the masses are riding that wave of exhilaration in the public square, genuinely believing they've already won, the ultimate fate of the revolution doesn't actually depend on their emotions or their viral hashtags. Ultimately, the survival of the state depends on the men with the guns.
Wait, so you're saying the passion, the shared garbage cans, the incredible bravery of facing down riot police, none of that dictates the final outcome. It really just comes down to the organizational chart of the country's military.
What's fascinating here is that, yes, the immediate survival of the state apparatus is almost entirely dictated by military structure. We have to look at the sharp distinction the sources make between professional or institutional militaries and factionalized militaries.
Okay, map that out for us. How does a professional military react to 1 million people in the streets?
So in countries like Tunisia and Egypt, the militaries were largely professional and corporate. They had distinct boundaries from the ruling political regime, and more importantly, they had their own macroeconomic empires.
Yeah.
In Egypt, the military isn't just an army. They manufacture bottled water, they build washing machines, they own luxury coastal resorts.
Oh, wow. So they're basically a huge corporation.
Exactly. So when the protests reached a boiling point and completely paralyzed the country, the military leadership looked at the dictator and realized he had become a massive liability to their bottom line.
They're losing money.
Right. So they refused to shoot the protesters. They essentially orchestrated a soft coup, ousting the leader to protect their own institutional and corporate interests. They preserved the Egyptian state by sacrificing the dictator. And they stood between the people and the regime, which made them look like absolute heroes initially.
But in Libya and Syria, it was a completely different story, right? The military didn't step in to play peacemaker?
Because in those countries, the militaries were factionalized. Dictators like Muammar Gaddafi and Bashar al-Assad intentionally built their militaries along tribal or sectarian lines. These armies weren't designed to protect the nation from foreign threats. They were specifically designed to protect the regime from its own citizens.
That is terrifying.
It is. So when the massive protests started, these militaries didn't step back to protect their business interests. They fractured. The core loyalist units tied to the dictator's sect used heavy weaponry, including artillery and chemical weapons in Syria, directly against civilian neighborhoods.
Which inevitably leads to massive state collapse and horrific civil war. The military's identity is tied completely to the dictator's survival, so if he goes down, they bring the whole country down with him.
Precisely. And then you have the completely unique structural case of Iran in 1979. The Shah had built what sociologists call a sultanistic military. It was heavily funded, highly equipped with American weapons, but entirely dependent on the Shah personally for every single decision.
Oh, so a bottleneck.
Right. When the Shah was paralyzed by the sheer scale of the protests and eventually fled the country, the military just simply collapsed. It melted away overnight, leaving a massive, terrifying power vacuum.
Which is where that one-way cassette tape communication from earlier comes back into play, doesn't it? You have a collapsed state, an evaporated army, and millions of people looking around wondering who is actually in charge.
Yes. Ayatollah Khomeini stepped directly into that void using charismatic authority. He possessed this perceived exceptional wisdom, religious authority, and unyielding integrity that allowed him to unify wildly disparate groups. You had militant clerics, wealthy bazaar merchants, and the secular, educated middle class all marching together.
That's a really fragile coalition.
Very fragile. But Khomeini used his charisma to hold that coalition together just long enough to consolidate power and build a brand new institutionalized theocratic order.
So if we look back at the Arab Spring, the lack of a unifying, charismatic leader is what allowed that initial euphoria of the digital protests to so quickly curdle into chaos. They had the numbers to clear the square, but they didn't have the unified leadership to fill the void.
Exactly. They could tear down the old structures, but they couldn't agree on what to build in its place.
Which brings us to the psychological hangover. The revolution succeeds, the dictator flees or is killed, the carnival in the square finally ends. What happens to a society's collective psyche when the adrenaline wears off?
Well, populations enter what researchers call the euphoria disillusionment cycle. The astronomical, almost utopian expectations generated during the struggle crash headfirst into the messy, slow, corrupt reality of governance. And very often, the revolution is essentially kidnapped by old elites who just put on new hats.
Romania's is the classic example of a kidnapped revolution, right? Because after Ceausescu was executed on live television, the people genuinely thought they had won.
But the people who stepped into the power vacuum were the so-called Iliescu plotters, former high-ranking Communist Party elites who simply rebranded themselves as Democrats. For the ordinary citizens who literally risked their lives standing in front of tanks, it left this lingering, toxic sense of mystery and betrayal. They had achieved freedom, but freedom suddenly just felt like a terrifying absence of rules, which led to rampant corruption and economic instability.
Now, what happens when a state collapses, not from an internal grassroots uprising, but from an external force? Because the sources dive deeply into Iraq in 2003.
Iraq is a crucial case study in the sheer trauma of state failure. The Ba'athist regime under Saddam Hussein was destroyed by a massive foreign invasion, the American shock and awe campaign. Because the collapse was imposed externally by a foreign military, the Iraqi population experienced no collective emotional release.
No shared victory.
Right. There was no shared psychological unity, no breaking of the fear barrier together in the public square.
It was just a sudden, violent dismantling of their entire national structure. I mean, the invading coalition dissolved the Iraqi army and purged the government. You suddenly had hundreds of thousands of men who were newly unemployed, heavily armed, and completely terrified about what was going to happen next.
And that environment of absolute terror perfectly explained the explosion of sectarianism. There's a massive misconception in the West that ancient sectarian hatred is the root cause of these Middle Eastern conflicts. But the research makes it very clear. Sectarianism is actually an outcome of state failure, not the cause.
Wait, explain that distinction, because that fundamentally changes how you look at the geopolitics of the whole region.
Think about it like this. A functioning state provides a social contract based on what sociologists call the 3Ps: protection, provision, and participation. The state protects you from violence, provides basic resources and infrastructure, and allows some form of civic participation.
Okay, makes sense.
When the state completely collapses and can no longer provide physical security or even basic food rations, people are thrust into an existential panic. They are forced to fall back on their deepest sub-state identities, their religious sect, their tribe, their local clan, just for basic biological survival.
Because if the police don't exist anymore, you need your local militia to protect your neighborhood. So political elites then weaponize those sectarian identities to build their own power bases in the rubble. It's a psychological adaptation to the trauma of a destroyed society.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, revolutions and state collapses do not end when the dictator is gone or the bronze statues are pulled down in the square. They plunge the population into a phase of collective generational trauma that completely shatters the basic fabric of society. The clinical statistics from these sources are genuinely staggering. In Syria, after years of brutal civil war, researchers found an 83% rate of PTSD among populations exposed to the conflict.
83% of the population suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. That's unfathomable.
Combine that with massive infrastructure damage to the mental health systems themselves. The sources report a 78% decline in psychiatric capacity in Libya and a 72% decline in Syria. You have an entire generation of children whose nervous systems are permanently stuck in fight or flight.
How do you even begin to build a functioning, trusting democracy when the entire electorate is suffering from severe, untreated trauma? Because democracy requires compromise and trust, right? But trauma demands hypervigilance.
It's the greatest hurdle of post-conflict reconstruction. War and trauma actively destroy trust in political institutions. Refugees and survivors feel profoundly betrayed by politicians, the international community, and the state apparatus itself. But, delving into the clinical data, the research revealed one incredibly surprising paradox about trust at the community level.
Oh, what did the clinicians find?
Among refugees from Syria and Iraq, researchers found that high conflict exposure, such as living through a neighborhood bombing or losing an immediate family member, that can actually increase generalized social trust.
Wait, really? Experiencing the absolute worst horrors of humanity makes you trust people more?
It sounds completely counterintuitive, I know, but think about the raw mechanics of survival in a war zone. In the absolute darkest moments, when the state has completely abandoned you and the bombs are falling, you survive solely because of the kindness and cooperation of your neighbors. Someone pulls you from the rubble with their bare hands. Someone shares their last ration of food with your children.
Wow.
Yeah. Those intensely positive, life-saving experiences of cooperation in the midst of absolute horror, they forge a powerful, resilient solidarity.
So they lose all faith in the government, in the system, but they gain a profound, battle-tested faith in each other.
Exactly. Translating that fierce community trust into national political stability, however, remains the great unsolved challenge of the post-revolutionary period.
Okay, let's take a breath. So what does this all mean? We started today's journey inside the silent, terrified pressure cooker of preference falsification. We watched that psychological dam break, replaced by a euphoric, deeply emotional explosion in the streets where people demanded their basic dignity. We explored how the cold, hard organizational chart of a military actually dictates whether a revolution survives the week. And finally, we unpacked the traumatic sectarian hangover that sets in when the state collapses and the carnival tent comes down.
It's a turbulent journey from suppressed trauma to collective empowerment, and tragically often right back into structural trauma.
It really is. But hopefully this gives you, the listener, a powerful new psychological blueprint. The next time you see a massive, joyous protest on the evening news or hear about a sudden regime change in a distant capital, you can look right past the simplified headlines. You know exactly what questions to ask.
Right, like what is the military doing?
Exactly. Are they protecting the nation's businesses or the dictator's life? Is there a charismatic leader waiting in the wings to build institutions? Or is it a leaderless social media movement running on outrage? And most importantly, what is the invisible psychological toll, the trauma that will be left behind for generations?
Because the legacy of that trauma dictates the future of the nation far more than the initial beautiful protests ever could.
To leave you with a final thought on just how long that psychological ghost lingers, remember Romania, the country that fought so bravely, where desperate people sacrificed themselves in front of tanks in the freezing winter of 1989. According to the sources, a recent sociological study found that today, 34% of young Romanians aged 16 to 25 say they actually prefer dictatorship over democracy.
It's a chilling, heartbreaking statistic, driven entirely by the endless corruption, the economic frustration, and the grinding instability of those post-revolutionary years.
It really is. It leaves you wondering, how long does the psychological ghost of an authoritarian regime haunt a society, making the children of a revolution crave the very chains their parents fought and died to break? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.